Good morning and good everyone. Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. We're going to give people just a few more minutes to join the webinar before we get started. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining today's webinar presenting the results from VectorWorks durability monitoring studies. Today, we're joined by the Technical Director from Tropical Health, Dr. Albert Kilian, and the Monitoring and Evaluation Regional Technical Advisor, Emmanuel Obi, to present on the results and the implications from these studies. My name is Sean Blaufuss, Program Officer with the VectorWorks project, and I'll also be presenting today on the webinar. We will have about 50 minutes of presentation, and after that, we'll have 30 minutes for question and answer. Please hold your questions until the end of the presentations. With that, I'll hand over to Dr. Kilian to begin the presentation.
Thank you, Sean, and good morning to everybody. Okay. The rationale for durability monitoring is for us to understand how long LLN lasts in the field, and mainly because we want to know how frequently we need to replace them and identify LLM brands that do not perform well or do particularly perform better than others. There are two main elements of durability monitoring that we need to separate. One is the physical durability that comprises, for one, the attrition, that is the loss by discarding of nets, meaning they are destroyed, thrown away, or used for other purposes. And the integrity, that is the physical condition of the nets that are still found in the households where the nets was distributed. And this is measured by the proportion hole index, which is again comprised of counting the holes in separate hole sizes and relating them proportionate to their relative size. Based on this integrity measurement, we can then determine whether a net is still serviceable. That is, we think it's still protecting the user as a physical barrier for protection against mosquitoes. The second element then is the insecticidal durability. And here we can separate two different measures. One is the bioassay, meaning we use live mosquitoes on the mosquito netting to see whether it is still effective. And the second element would be to measure the chemical in and on the net to see whether there are still sufficient levels. The specific objectives of monitoring of durability under VectorWorks were threefold. First, to monitor the durability of LIN distributed through mass campaigns in 2 or 3 sites in each country. And here, two different scenarios were possible. One, to compare the same or very similar brand in different places, or compare 2 different brands and then use them in the same or very similar site. The second objective was to better understand the determinants that drive LRN durability so that it can help us design interventions that make a net last longer. And thirdly, strengthen capacity of the malaria programs and their partners to undertake durability monitoring and other surveys and convey the specific skills that are necessary to analyze and interpret durability monitoring data. When we started with VectorWorks, we basically took over from what Networks had done. And there were already some retrospective durability studies done that gave us some indication of what behavioral determinants we should be looking at. Also, Networks had contributed to the development of a comprehensive methodology for a standardized assessment of physical durability that was endorsed by WHO guidance in 2013 with these two documents that you see on the screen. And this enabled us for the first time to actually have a methodology that was comparable between brands across sites and gave us good results that we can work with. During VectorWorks, we helped to produce a standard protocol for a positive cohort approach to durability monitoring, and we provided a complete suite of tools for data collection, analysis, and reporting, which is available on the web. We also produced quality reports on time on the durability monitoring sites that we had. And these were 5, where we completed durability monitoring over a 3-year period. 4 were in Africa, Nigeria, DRC, Zanzibar and Tanzania, and Mozambique. And then we had Myanmar in Southeast Asia. In addition, there were 3 countries, Liberia, Ghana, and Kenya, where we started durability monitoring, but will not be able to finish it due to the end of our project, and we will handing over this activity to the VectorLinks project. And finally, in Zambia, we provided technical support for the baseline training and setup of durability monitoring. In Mozambique and Nigeria were the 2 sites where we compared same or similar brand in different environments. In Mozambique, the LRM brands were Royal Sentry and Magnet, which, although different manufacturers, they have exactly the same specifications. And in Nigeria, it was the polyester net Dawa Plus 2. The comparisons between different brands were in Zanzibar between Permanet and Olicet, in DRC between Dawa Plus and Duranet, which again is the same specifications as Royal Sentry and Magnet. And in Myanmar, it was Dawa Plus and Permanet. We also had the constellation in Liberia, where Duranet was tested in 2 sites. In Kenya, Dawa Plus versus Duranet. In Ghana, Dawa Plus versus Olicet. Just a short reminder of the methodology for those who are not familiar with it. The design is in principle a prospective cohort study of a representative sample of LRNs from the campaign. So the study itself does not distribute the nets, but links into the malaria control program activity of the mass campaign. And then within 1 to 6 months after that distribution, the cohort of nets is established at the baseline service. And then this cohort is followed up over time after 1, 2, and 3 years, although the exact times vary sometimes due to logistical implications such as rainy season or other things. At each time point, all nets of the cohort are assessed for the physical integrity, and they also is confirmed whether they're still there, and if they're not there, why they are not there. Subsamples are taken at each time point also from campaign nets for the bioassay. We did not routinely do chemical residue testing, but only when there were ambiguous results from the bioassay. The major outcome for physical durability is the proportion of nets surviving in serviceable condition at a given time point. And just as a reminder, the important thing is the denominator comprises all nets that are still in the household and evaluated for physical damage, plus those nets that for which we know for sure that they're no longer usable for sleeping under and therefore not serviceable, which means that is the proportion thrown away, destroyed, or used for other purposes. Those nets distributed at the campaign for which we know they're no longer in the household where they were given to initially, but they may be being used by other people, are excluded from the denominator. Once we have this percent surviving to time X, we then can convert this to a median survival time, which means the time at which the surviving rate is exactly 50%. The insecticidal durability is measured in the bioassay using the WHO cone test. In other words, we expose laboratory-bred mosquitoes, for which we know they have no resistance to the pyrethroid, to the netting for 3 minutes, take them off, and then see the knockdown rate after 1 hour and the mortality rate after 24 hours. And this is then combined to 2 measures, the optimal effectiveness, where we know for sure there's very good insecticidal responsiveness, and the minimal effectiveness, where we can say there's still some protection of the user, but it is no longer optimal. And anything below that then is a failing in the testing of bioassay.
Capacity strengthening. In carrying out the durability monitoring, we needed to build the capacity of malaria programs and national partners to undertake and analyze airline durability studies according to the currently recommended methodologies. One of the key personnel we needed to train and build their capacity on durability monitoring was the field teams. And in each site, we had 1 coordinator plus monitors from the national and subnational levels trained. We also have, in each of the sites, we have 2 teams, depending on the country. In Nigeria, we had 3 teams. In Mozambique, 3 teams. In Tanzania and DRC, we had 2 teams per site. And each site is supervised by a supervisor and with 3 interviewers. Preceding any of these studies, we had a 5-day baseline training of data collection, which was also part of capacity building as part of a requirement for baseline data collection. For month 12, 24, and 36, we conducted 3 days refresher training to also bring to bear, because it's an annual data collection, to speed up with what they have learned in the last 1 year, and just to refresh the field teams on what's expected to do. Key on the agenda for building the capacity of field teams requires them to understand how to track households and coordinates already recruited. And this was done using 2 tools. We used the annual updated lists and the GPS coordinate and mapping software to ensure that these field teams are able to go back to the households, the exact households, and conduct data collection. Before each round of data collection, we normally have the training, and before that, we had the pre and post tests. And this pre and post test is to first check the level of the field teams as against and after the training. The slide you are seeing currently shows 2017 and 2018 pre and post tests for 2 rounds, where evidently showed that the capacity of the field teams improved every year as we conduct the refresher trainings. And in 2018, I can see at post-test, which is 74.7, you can see that in 2017, it was 61.1, giving a very big rise, that the capacity within field teams was still strong and could still continue the data collection. Field teams were trained how to use collect data using a tablet and with an ODK Open Data Kit software. Coordinators of each team were trained to upload data daily, extraction, and provide quality checks for optimal data quality. And this was done by all sites coordinators to ensure that before the next day data, the teams understand the kind of data they've collected, and as well provide feedback on previous day data collection. The second component of the capacity building was for stakeholders, and these were mainly the national and the subnational malaria control programs and partners. The training workshops focused mainly on the durability monitoring concept, the design, and as well as field implementation. And the trainings also, that workshop also looked at what is required at baseline and what is required at follow-up training. So this was also capacity build. The NMCPs and partners were also exposed to data analysis, interpretation, and reporting of durability monitoring as part of strengthening their capacity for DM. The DRC is a typical case study where transfer of knowledge started and led by VectorWorks for training and for data analysis at baseline. But at the end of the 36 months of follow-up, that capacity was 100% handled by the local partners and the NMCP during training and data analysis. And that shows that we have met that objective of building the capacity of NMCPs and partners to undertake similar durability monitoring exercise. The photos you're seeing are mainly field experiences, telling you there was a strong community participation and ownership of the whole period. We had community mobilization, early community mobilizations, where the chiefs and the sheikhs were fully aware and provided support and informed the households that this was going to happen, and the households were ready to participate. The community also provided a lot of logistical local guides to assist the field teams in getting back to their cohort households and also identifying their nets. Yeah, I mean, irrespective of this, the field experience show that even the households, even with their businesses, we are still happy to host the field teams and give them attention to carry out their duties as prescribed. In summary, we can say here that the capacity of NMCPs and at the national and subnational levels can organize training, field implementation, and monitoring. Alongside biosafety testing was done locally in some countries, especially in the Zanzibar Malaria Elimination Program, which had this done 100% from baseline up to month 36 of data collection. Our field team saturation was low in all sites, indicating that, and we've been showing earlier slides, that we had good results of capacity, well-trained, and better results at the end of the studies.
So what did we find? Let us first look at the comparison that we did with the same or similar LIM brands in different settings, which are on the one hand, Mozambique with Royal Sentry and Magnet, and on the other hand, Nigeria with the Blaufuss. On these graphs here, you see the proportion of nets at each time point that were still in serviceable condition. And it is plotted against some hypothetical lines that depict the line that we expect in losses of a net that would have a 1, a 2, or 3 year median survival. And in both countries, we saw one side that particularly was different than the others. And in Mozambique, this was Nampula, where after 2.7 years, about 33% only, instead of the expected around 50%, were still in serviceable condition. This was the Royal Sentry in this case, while the other two sites were in the range of around plus minus 50%. And in Nigeria, you see that one side was particularly high. In Zamfara, in the northwest of Nigeria, we found that 80% of the nets were still in service, surviving in serviceable condition after 3 years. This, as you can say, is in a different ballpark. If we translate these to median survival times, we can see that in Nampula, we only saw a median survival of 2.2 years, while the other two sites were at least around the 3 year expected target. In contrast, in Nigeria, we see both lower sites at around or slightly above 3 years, and Zamfara site was expected to have a median survival of 5.3 years. Using survival analysis, where we can use all data points simultaneously to see the difference between the curves and not only between single data points, confirms that Nampula was lower than TET or Inyaban in Mozambique, and that Zamfara was significantly higher than Ebonyi and Oyo. On the other hand, here the comparisons between two different brands in the same or very similar environment. And here, this is the result from DRC, where you see one curve, the red line here, which is Mongana, where Blaufuss was distributed, where after only 2.5 years, only 17% of the cohort nets were still in serviceable condition. But also the other net, Dura net in this case, had only 37 after 2.5 years, which obviously is very far under the expected line. And in Zanzibar, we saw two brands compared. The green line is permanent, the red line is Olised. And although the distance was not as distinct as it was in DRC, we see that the red line is consistently below the green line. And translating this to median survival times, we had only 1.7 years median survival for Dawa Plus in DRC and 2.2 years for Duranet, while Permanet in Zanzibar had a survival of 2.9 and Olised 2.7 years. Then again, using survival analysis, we could show that obviously Duranet was better than Dawa Plus in the DRC setting, but we also can show that taking all data points into consideration, Olised significantly performed worse than Permanet in Zanzibar. A different situation we saw in Myanmar. As you can see here, the green line is the Permanet, the red line is the Dawa Plus. While they first initially were around 3 years or 3 years plus line, they then increasingly crossed over to 4 or 5 years of survival, with an estimated at the end of 4.9 and 5.5 years. But this is a little bit unusual because the curves seem to be crossing and survival seems to increase over time. Using survival analysis, but there was some evidence that there was a slight difference between the two brands, but also that it was not consistent over time. And taking all points into consideration, the median survival was estimated at 4.2 and 3.9 years only. So a little bit less than what we saw on the graph. What is the explanation for this unusual behavior? For one is 94% of the households had non-cohort nets, that is nets other than for those from the campaign. And 56% of these were untreated nets. Not only 95% had other nets, but at each time point, more than 80% of the household had other nets, and these were nets that they did prefer over the LIN nets. Overall, 81% of the cohort nets were used at one time in this study, but at each time point over the 3 years, only 43 to 53% were found hanging. And if we looked at those nets ever found hanging, only 60% of the times that they were observed, they were actually hanging. This implies that the use was off and on of these nets, and therefore we assume that the survival was longer than it was actually expected in normal circumstances. To complete the picture, here are the data from Kenya and Liberia, for which we only have 1 year follow-up data so far. But on the left-hand side in Kenya, you see we also compare Dawa Plus and Duranet, and we also see actually very low rates, similar to DRC with 1.6 and 2.1 years. But in this case, the red curve is the Duranet and the green curve is the Dawa Plus. So an exact reversal of the situation that we saw in DRC. In contrast, Duranet in Liberia so far after 1 year has performed really well with rates slightly above 3 years, and we expect it to be somewhere between 3 and 4 years in the follow-up that will come after VectorWorks. If we now pool this data together differently and look just at the brands, on the left-hand side you see for Dawa Plus, we see a huge array of results from DRC, 1.7 years up to the 5.3 in Zamfara, Nigeria, and everything else in between is represented. In the same way for Duranet, we have only one long-term follow-up, but the other two suggest that there is a similar range of results of the same brand with the same specifications in different locations. And if we then add Royal Central Magnet to this picture, because they are the same specification and can be counted as at least a very similar LIM, we also see that this is confirmed the huge range of results that we find. So we can say, for one, we found some differences between brands in the same location, but these were not consistent. So we cannot simply describe them, it's polyester versus polyethylene or 100 denier versus 150. Because obviously there are other factors at play that determine why one specific textile performs better in one situation, but worse in the other. We believe that knitting pattern could be one of these, but this is an area that needs further research. But we also confirmed the findings from previous studies, the huge differences between sites with the same brand that are attributable to environmental or use behavior of the nets. So what can we say about these key determinants? Well, we looked at net use environment and net handling, variables that we had collected during the studies. And we assessed these variables across all follow-up surveys, so it was not dependent only on one single observation in one survey, but we made a more robust assessment across all 4 surveys that were conducted. We constructed a composite net care attitude score, which was also evaluated across all surveys. And we found that there was some variation of the combination or intensity of different determinants in each of the countries and sites. But overall, there were some clear trends across the 4 African sites that we can say emerged as explanation for this huge variation in durability. And for one, we can say a very positive attitude towards net care is definitely and strongly a preventive element. We can also say that a net that is only ever used by adults lives longer. Never folding up the net during the day is a bad idea as it contributes to damage. And having more than 2 children under 10 showed in the models to be an increasing element of risk for the net. This, of course, does not mean just cause and effect. If you have children, you have holes in your net. It only means that it is a proxy for certain behaviors within the family, within the household, that can facilitate an increased damage to the nets. The type of sleeping place also played a role, but it was not as strong as, for example, the net care attitude. And it can be overcome by good care behavior. So if you have a reed mat on the ground where you have your net, and that in principle could increase the damage, but if you are careful, it will not. So sleeping place variables were not always a consistent explanation for the damage seen. And in some settings, we also saw that female-headed households did provide or did do a slightly better job in protecting their nets. Based on this, we asked ourselves, can we predict the physical durability from knowing the constellation of risk factors at baseline, so that this can be used as a tool to say, in this area, I expect a good or above or below average performance of a given LIM. So we constructed a risk index out of 3 elements of the behaviors of net handling, use environment, and net care and repair, and plotted this against, from baseline results, against the median survival that we found at the end of the study. And the results you see here that there is a reasonably good correlation. It is not as good as could be with a coefficient of correlation of 53%, but nonetheless, it allows us to say reduction of the risk index by 10 points could extend the median survival by half a year. And if we put the confidence interval around this, we see there is still considerable uncertainty, which means before this can be made a tool in the day-to-day management of malaria programs, some little more work will be needed. Now, what about hanging? We had seen that initially, immediately after the campaign, many of the nets were still in their packages. And some of the nets were even never hung. So here we see for all 4 African countries, the plot for each side of the nets that were ever recruited at baseline, whether they're found hanging at any one time, point in time during the 3-year follow-up. And we see for one that immediately after baseline, from year 1 onwards, the hanging rate was actually quite high and then increased further until the final point. We also see that there are 2 sites, which is Oyo in Nigeria and Mongala in DRC, which actually never exceeded 50 to 60% of these nets being hung. Keep in mind, though, this includes nets that were given away immediately after the campaign to other people. So we have to say they were never hung in the households that they were given to. But we see also that most of the sites, we never exceed, or we level out at about 70, 75%. And only one site, which again is Zamfara in North Nigeria, reaches a hanging rate of almost 100%. So what does that mean, and what is behind this lower than expected hanging rate? We found, for one, that use was closely linked to hanging, meaning that if a net was hung in 95 to 98%, it was also used the night before, meaning hanging is a strong proxy for use. And for the hanging, we found that 3 elements influenced whether a net was hung or not. That is the availability of other nets in the household other than those from the campaign, meaning nets they had owned at the time of the campaign or that they received in the 3 years of the follow-up from other sources. Then the overall net supply situation in the household. How many nets did the household have available to share among their members? And thirdly, the physical condition of a net played also a significant role. Looking at this last element here, you see the curve of nets that were ever found hanging by the damage of the net. So good nets, damaged nets, and torn nets, and here we divided the torn nets even further up in the torn and the very torn. And you can see on the curve, the slightly damaged nets, the hanging rate of those that were ever found hanging was over 90%, and then slightly declined up to where they were torn, and then they were very torn, the hanging rate, and therefore use rate, significantly dropped off. Meaning, as more damage appears on the net, the less people are likely to use the net. But what about this part? Why are good nets not hanging? Well, obviously, this was an effect that after the campaign, they were not originally or immediately hung. So if we look at the time for only the good nets, the time from baseline to 36-month surveys, you see after 1 year, the hanging rate already for ever hanging and all nets was considerably high, although it did not quite reach the level of the nets with a little bit less damage. To examine this further, we looked at 3 elements. For one, we looked at the median or mean number of nets in the household, meaning the net supply in the household, which is the green line you see here, and the reference line here of 0.5 means that is 1 net for every 2 people. The other blue curve is campaign or cohort nets being hung, and the orange line is the other nets, the non-cohort nets being hung. And looking at all sites in all countries, we saw that 2 different patterns emerged. For one, we see here Mozambique and Zanzibar, very high supply initially, 0.7, which is about 1 net for every 1.5 people. So a little bit of oversupply immediately at the campaign. And at this point in time, campaign net use was extremely low, but other net use was very high. And these other net use remained high, indicating that as use of campaign nets increased, but people first used the old nets before they switched to the newer nets. The opposite is the case in Nigeria and DRC. We see less ownership here because initially there was some good supply, but then it decreased below the 0.5 mark, meaning there were not enough nets in a number of households. And here we see a higher use of the cohort nets and a decline initially for the non-cohort nets, and then increasing when the supply got scarce. Meaning in this scenario, the new nets were the preferred nets in use, and the non-cohort nets were only used when not enough were available. 2 distinct patterns which we have to take into account when we look at monitoring LLINs. So what does this mean, this delay of hanging for survival estimates? We look here at the survival curves for those nets where the risk was calculated from the time of the campaign, which we could call the intention to treat approach, and compare that to the risk or the survival of the nets when we consider the risk only starting at the time when they were first hung. We can think of this of either a program effectiveness approach, considering the ITN strategy in the country, and the other one an efficacy approach of the net per se. So if we then pool our data and run a survival analysis and extrapolate the median survival, we find that in our intention to treat approach, the median survival in our sample was 3 years exactly. And for those when the risk was only considered once the net was hung, was actually almost 0.8 years less, or only 2.2, meaning that is the discrepancy between if you had no other nets and when you have other nets available. One thing that surprised us a little bit, at least, was what we found about repairs. We had seen already under networks that it was very difficult or impossible to achieve very high rates of repairs in populations. And with our VectorWorks data now, we are able to explore what actual impact repair has on physical survival. And first here we look at just the correlation between repairs and the damage in nets. The orange line is the proportion of nets with any holes that have been found with any repairs over time. And the blue line is the level of damage, the median hole index of these very same nets. And we see that first, repairs were low in Mozambique, and the highest rate we ever got in Zanzibar at the end of the study was 45. But it appears that repair only increases when the damage in the nets is already relatively high. So we explored this further, and here we look at the median hole index separately by nets with no repair and those with repair, and categorize it by the categories of damage. And we see in good nets, actually the hole index was higher in the repaired nets than in the unrepaired nets. In slightly damaged nets, absolutely no difference in the median hole index, no difference in the torn nets. Only in the very torn nets, we find that repaired nets showed a lower, significantly lower hole index than the unrepaired nets. And if we then use survival analysis and say the risk of survival only starts when the first hole appears, so that we can compare if a net starts to be damaged, does then doing repair increase the survival chances? And here we see the red line is the repaired net and the blue line, the unrepaired net, and we see there's absolutely no difference between them, meaning repairs are too little, too late, and repairs do not work. So finally, we look at the insecticidal effectiveness. On this graph, you see the last assessment that we could make, 36 months, and in some cases before that, and look at optimal, minimal, and failing of the insecticidal effectiveness. For the Dawa Plus in Nigeria, we see after 3 years and 2 years in Oyo, very good results with as expected, over 80% optimal performance. However, the Dawa Plus in DRC, after 3 years, had a very low optimal performance, and not even half of the nets had at least minimal performance. So more than 50% failed. Similarly, after only 1 year, the Dawa Plus in Kenya had the similar result with less than 50% or around 50% only minimal performance. For this Dawa Plus in Kenya, we know from the manufacturer that they announced that they had some issues in quality control and there might be nets with insufficient insecticides, and obviously this is one of the group. But the results from DRC might also suggest that even before that, and these nets were actually purchased end of 2015, early 2016, there were already some quality issues with Dawa Plus at that time. The permanet in Zanzibar had very good performance, and Dawa Plus and permanet both in Myanmar were somewhat ambiguous, where we saw lower than expected, but still good minimal results. But in this case, the bioassays were done with Aedes albopictus and not Anopheles, and the chemical residue actually suggested that the content of the insecticide was still at a level that should have been protective. For the Duranet, we can say in DRC, after 3 years, the insecticidal protection was excellent, even though the nets were failing physically. And also in Liberia and Kenya, after 1 year, we saw excellent results for Duranet. Oliset also, after 3 years in Zanzibar, had a very good performance. And after 2 years, the Royal Centurion Magnet in Mozambique had excellent results, but then dropped off a little bit, with having lower than expected optimal effectiveness in Mozambique. And the chemical residue here from what done by CDC shows a somewhat inconclusive picture, where about half of the nets of Royal Century and 74% of the magnet samples were not quantifiable, which means they had no measurable insecticide, while for the others, the insecticide level was actually within the norm.
We've already shown that there is significant variation between sites in terms of the expected survival of nets. So what proportion of that can we say is attributable to the behaviors? Throughout the studies, we've looked at a number of determinants, many of which have a behavioral aspect that have proven in the literature to be linked to the longevity of the net, and possibly with better behavior, we might be able to extend the life of those nets. In this figure, we have a list of these determinants that we've looked at. At the top of the list are net behaviors that we expect to have few or no financial or structural barriers to adaptation at the household level. Whereas on the bottom, we have household environmental variables where there may be some limited behavioral component, but would be difficult to change at a societal level. For instance, at the top, hanging nets or folding nets up that are currently hanging over the bed when they are not in use is something we can expect families to be able to do without any additional expenditure of money or any additional time during their daily routine. On the other hand, what type of bed the net was hung over may be something that can be addressed through different buying patterns, but it is largely based on financial availability, household preferences, and possibly the availability of improved bed structures. This is important when we're thinking about social and behavior change and campaigns, and maybe what behaviors we might want to target if we are hoping to increase the survival of the net by increasing the level of net care provided by the household. We're going to look at a few of these specific behaviors and the results that we've seen across the different sites and countries. The first one we'll look at is nets not being tied up during the day when they're not in use. Here we have Mozambique, DRC, and Myanmar. Each of the different bar graphs in each column is representative of a different study period. Baseline in blue, 12-month follow-up in red, green is the 24-month follow-up, and finally the purple lines indicate 36-month follow-up. As you can see, in many sites, most of the nets were not tied up or folded out of the way during the day, exposing them to risk, particularly in sites like Inhambane in Mozambique, Mongala and Sudabangi in DRC, and somewhat in the other sites here in Mozambique and Myanmar. You can see that the lines approach 90% at almost every data collection point, indicating that almost every net in the country or at these sites is not being tied up or put out of the way during the day. This is a behavior, again, that would require very little or no financial outlay and no time for the household to adjust. With social and behavior change campaigns, this may be something we could target to increase the longevity of the net. In Zanzibar and Nigeria, looking at the same behavior, nets not being tied up during the day, we see numbers that are better, but still each of the different sites in both Zanzibar and Nigeria crosses over at least 40% in at least one of the 4 survey periods, indicating that 4 out of 10 nets at a minimum may not have been tied up during the day. This is a behavior that across all of the countries that were surveyed as part of VectorWorks durability studies, a behavior that possibly could be increased or should be targeted, again, because of the potential ease of adaptation at the household level, but also because of the number of households who are not meeting the ideal behavior for this particular determinant. Moving forward, we'll look at the use of bleach or detergents to wash the insecticide-treated net. Using a bleach or detergent can impact the insecticidal effectiveness and is not recommended. Instead, we want households to use a mild soap. In both Zanzibar and Myanmar, across sites, we see greater than 80, approaching 90% of households using exclusively detergents or bleach. It should be noted that almost in all cases, this was a detergent, and households would use the same detergent that they're used to clean their clothes when washing their mosquito net. This is a behavior where there might be a small financial difference between buying a detergent or a mild soap, but it's something that could reasonably be expected to be changed with the right blend of communication. In contrast, in Nigeria, DRC, and Mozambique, while we do see some high points and the use of detergents and bleach is high in specific settings at specific times, overall, use of these soaps is relatively low, and the mild soaps are commonly used, particularly in Ebonyi in Nigeria and parts of DRC and Inhambane in Mozambique. This is demonstrative of the different net care behaviors and determinants. Some of them, like not hanging your net up or not tying your net up during the day, may be almost universal and things that we should consider packaging into net care SBCC. However, others, like the use of bleach or detergent, are more on a case-by-case basis and based on what data is available, might be something that should be targeted locally. This figure, developed by VectorWorks, shows the life cycle of an ITN from acquisition through net use, net care, and all the way through net end of life. At each of these different phases of the ITN, we have different target behaviors that we would like to promote. In the red square, we see net care, which we want to discuss today. Net care may be a behavior that we don't want to target at one specific time, but rather we'd prefer to have messaging and SBC occurring throughout the life of the net to remind the household of the key behaviors to prolong the net life. However, when we look at exposure to malaria and net-related messages in the past 6 months, we see most of the countries have periods where there is significantly less exposure than at other times. And in some countries, like Zanzibar and Myanmar, exposure to messages overall never reaches past 50%. In contrast, in Nigeria and Zamfara, we see that throughout all 4 survey periods, exposure to messages in the last 6 months related to ITNs surpassed 60%. This was mostly done through interpersonal communication. If we have different messages that should target different attitudes related or different behaviors related to different phases of the net life, perhaps we should consider increasing exposure to net messages through ongoing SBC targeting net care. Albert mentioned this earlier, but one of the factors most attributable to increased survival of nets is the household's attitude towards net. During the surveys, we ask a series of questions and then classify the household's attitude as positive, very positive, or negative. This graph here shows the odds of a net failing to survive in serviceable condition relative to the number of times that household recorded a very positive net attitude in the surveys. What we see is a protective effect with increasing dose or increasing number of very positive scores recorded by the household. By the time a household records 2 or more very positive attitude scores, the odds of failure have decreased from to 60% from the initial or relative to the reference group of never recording a very positive score. So what are the overall SBC implications of these ITN durability studies? Intensified SBC may be an opportunity to improve key durability behaviors and increase net life. This may be particularly intriguing if the other option would be additional procurement of nets and distribution. Focusing on behaviors with lower structural and financial barriers are likely to yield better results. So if we think of the figure that had the different net determinants with different behavioral aspects, if we're looking at the behaviors at the top of that chart, those are the ones that were most likely to get the most bang for our buck if we're doing SBC campaigns. And finally, durability determinant data may be a useful addition to malaria behavior surveys, CAP surveys, or other surveys to inform SBCC. We know that there is significant variation among countries in durability, but also that the behaviors responsible for this variance are also likely to change from setting to setting.
So what does all this mean? Do we need to replace nets more frequently? Well, in some places such as DRC, probably, at least temporarily, until we can figure out a way to increase the survival in these settings. In other, a longer interval could be considered, such in Zamfara, if we have sufficient evidence that the insecticidal effectiveness also keeps up over these extended periods. But given these huge variation in survival that we find between brands in the same place and between sites, would it not be better to have a demand-driven, continuous distribution system that replaces a net when it needs replacing in order to minimize the inefficiencies of more frequent repeat campaigns? Well, would it help to have more durable nets? Certainly it would. But we still have not figured out how to make them more durable and not pay a price of $300 or more. So here, more work is needed, and particularly also, how do we provide then the evidence that the product will perform better in a standardized environment and incorporate that into the procurement process? And some of you may then here have a deja vu effect, because this is something we discussed in 2014 at the end of networks in the international malaria community and with WHO. And some may recall there was something like a resistance to damage score for textile that would help to do this. However, in 2014, the ball was dropped on this and no further activities were done. Is there room to improve net care? Definitely, as you have heard Sean explain in detail, but we also need to better understand the dynamics and the interactions that are at play in order to devise programs that are specific to the environments in which we work. We definitely should focus our communication on prevention behaviors and not on repair, as we have conclusively shown that repairs do not really extend the useful life. But we should not forget the socioeconomic development and the environment in the household is the best net care. So what should we do next? For one, probably we should ensure that manufacturers don't relax the quality assurance for the insecticidal content. We also think we should restart discussion of how to improve LI and textile durability qualities and add these to procurement criteria. And we should develop effective social and behavior change intervention packages. But as you know, this is the last appearance of VectorWorks. And from now on, it is what you think. Thank you.
All right. We will now move forward to question and answer. If you have a question for any of our panelists, please feel free to ask in the question box, the Q&A box, and we will answer the questions in the order that they are received. Okay, so we'll give just another minute or two to allow participants to ask questions in the Q&A box on Zoom. If we don't see anything in the next couple of minutes, then we will wrap early. All questions are welcome. All right, Musa, it looks like you have your hand up. Please feel free to ask your question. All right, we have our first question from Yoshito. In regards to slide 12, what does it mean by also tunnel test if Oliset failed the cone test?
This refers to an extra test that is done if the cone test fails. And it is particularly common for Oliset nets because they are the only ones that use permethrin rather than delta methylene or alpha cypermethrin. And permethrin has a very strong repellent effect. So if you use a plastic cone, as we do with the WHO test, the mosquitoes will not like to sit on the net and instead prefer just sitting on the plastic cone. Therefore, they are not properly exposed to the insecticide, and therefore the cone assays often fails with the Olisec net. In these cases, we perform a tunnel test by which a tunnel is constructed on which on one end there is a guinea pig, and then there's the netting material put in between with some holes cut into it, and the mosquitoes are released in the chamber before the netting material. So if they want to have a blood meal, they have to penetrate through the mosquito net, being exposed to the insecticide. And then we can determine the mortality rate and the feeding inhibition rate. And therefore, in these cases, in most of the times, Olisec then has optimal performance. That is an additional test that is recommended by WHO if there is reason to believe that the insecticide being tested has a strong repellent effect.
Okay, we have our next question from Ibrahim Traore. Any experience on how to improve the use of cohort nets instead of non-cohort nets?
Well, I'm not sure that is exactly what we want. We want the household to use the best nets they have available. And if we consider a cohort net 3 years into the trial and we already have significant damage and they get new nets from ANC, it is probably advisable that they use those. What we pointed out is that if you want to study the survival of nets in a given cohort, over the period of time, in our times, we always have input of other nets. And therefore, in order to interpret our data, we need to take into account. But I don't think our objective will be to have them use the cohort nets until they're totally torn, if they at the same time have better nets available in the household.
Next question from Fuhaili. Can we get the conclusion of which brand is better from the reports?
Well, obviously, as we pointed out during the presentation, that is very difficult to do because we found in one setting, one brand was better than the other, and the very same two brands in another setting were exactly reversed. So there is no clear answer to say, in general, this brand is better than that brand. We can only say that one brand in a given setting performed better than the other, but in another setting, it was the other way around. So therefore, it is the combination of a net and the setting that only makes sense to us, not per se one brand that in any setting will perform better than another one.
All right, and it looks like our next question is from Musa Sise. Did you conduct SBC during DM when the proportion of net serviceable was lower than expected before the 3 years monitoring? So for the durability studies, this is an exclusive monitoring activity, and we did not want to impact the results by conducting a net care SBC campaign amid the study. We have recommendations and data that hopefully will inform future SBC, but during the DM studies, no such SBC was conducted. Do we have any other questions before we closed for the day? All right. 2 more questions. Yoshito asked, can we get the presentation? And perhaps I should have mentioned this in the opening, but this webinar is being recorded and will be available on vectorworks.org and will be also sent out to all participants. So yes, the answer will be available shortly via a few different channels. And from anonymous attendee, regarding the expected life for a net, can you confirm the years expected given the possession of other nets or not? So I think the question is, does the possession of other nets impact the amount of years we would expect the net to survive?
Well, yes, as we have shown, the factor of other nets being available and used first or in a later point in time does impact. And what we could show that on average, the difference in survival is around 0.8 years. So this is what we can say, that the availability of other nets prolongs, in a programmatic approach, the survival of these nets in the field.
All right, it looks like we have no more questions. Thank you to everyone for joining us today. As we stated earlier, the presentation will be available and sent out within the next day. If you have any other questions, please feel free to contact VectorWorks and we will be happy to get back to you. Thank you.